I am so optimistic about the potential within each one of us to experience greater liberation in this lifetime. And I think that's the starting point. Then that's where we should start. And let's move towards these more joyful, purposeful, wondrous lives that also feed into this essential transformation that has to be taking place.
I absolutely agree. So I'm
Yeah.
going to ask you the big question we ask all the guests
Hmm.
is what does humanity need to acknowledge and understand for us to evolve?
Insight and awareness, spiritual explorer. Soul intuitive, emotional and spiritual mentor and award-winning author, Lorraine Nylon.
Welcome, explorers. Thank you for being part of the adventure. Today, our guest is Jeff Golden, and he's written a book called Reclaiming the Sacred, Healing Our Relationship with Ourselves and the World. Thank you for being part of this, Jeff. I am very curious to ask you, why have you written this book? And how did you come to understand all the stuff that you have in your book?
Well, hello to you and hello to everyone listening. It's a pleasure to be here. And right off the bat, this very first question just helps to explain why I'm delighted to be here. Most times when I talk with people, it's very quick, and I'm talking with people where I can't maybe assume a lot about their viewpoints of the world or how they might respond to me. But I love it because right off the bat, with this very first question, I'm going to answer in what is for me the truest way. This book, I was a medium for this book. This book is the most purposeful thing I've experienced in my life, and I say that as someone who has lived with deep purpose throughout my life. I worked on this book for over 10 years and knew on such a deep cellular level that this was what I was meant to be doing. And I could tell, and it's an interesting and fun story actually, the more logistical concretes why I wrote this, how I wrote it, what motivated it. But I'm going to go ahead and just go to that deeper, honest truth with you and say this book was meant to be written. And it was such an honor to me the way that it unfolded for me and through me. This was not at all the book that I thought I was writing, but the
Yes.
way that, yeah, that
Yeah,
sounds
yeah,
familiar, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
No, not at all. And it's gone through many revisions, but it was clear with each revision that it was moving in the right direction and there was more that needed to be opened up. And at times I was frustrated at how long it was taking, and I'd get distracted by something or something would be just sticking. And then 6 months later or a year later, when I would come back to that section, it was just so obvious why it wasn't coming then, because something that I had lived and seen or learned in that interim period just opened something entirely fresh and new that couldn't have been written before. And that's the way this entire book unfolded for me, was sometimes a slog and sometimes just running into a wall. But eventually, every time, sort of this luminous door opening, even if it wasn't where I thought it was going to be, I look over there and there it is, and we move through, and something else entirely new and beautiful unfolded. So, again, I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad that even with the very first question, I can already start by just speaking on that deep purpose level around what this was like and what it's been like as a gift for me to get to be the medium for this book.
And see, I have a view on those books that are like that. See, I
Hmm.
call them living documents. So
Mm,
when something's been because when something's been written that way,
hmm.
even for the reader, they should read it that way as well. You know, as
Mm,
in if they come into a section and they're reading it and they don't understand it, I would say put a sticky
mm,
note on it and
mm.
go away. Come back a couple of days later, or come back a week later, or a month later, or whatever, and
Hmm.
I bet you that you've had the experiences that when you read it again, you go,
Right,
I so get that.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And it's interesting too because it's not just, should we say, like a forward progression, like I keep evolving and my understandings deepen. And so now I look back on the book and some of those parts seem old or immature. No, it's a little bit more like, wow, I was in such a deep place when I wrote that, or wow, where did that come from? Like, and because it was over 10 years, and because at this point, it's been about 6 to 7 months since I did the last edit and started making it available. I find myself having to go back and look at it at times to remind myself. I just went so deep in certain areas. that I can't hold that all. And sometimes I myself have to go back and look at this and will be like, wow, something was really coming through me that day or that month because I am being opened by this now rather than being the one who's helping to open or feed it, if that makes sense.
It does. Well,
Yeah,
like, that's what I call a living document. So
yeah.
even sometimes when I go back and I read my own stuff, I can read it like I didn't write it. Like I
Hmm.
go, oh, but it's because you're at a different layer,
Right.
and a
Yeah.
different understanding.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I even had someone quote something to me, and I went, "That's brilliant. Who wrote that?" And she went, "You did." And I went, "Oh, okay." I didn't even recognize it was my stuff. So that's what I
Hmm.
refer to as living documents. Your
Yes.
your
Yes.
book is packed with a lot of stuff. This is a book
Yeah.
that you more or less have to take your time with it to really absorb it. But
Yes.
I really liked one of your statements in the book where it talks about the poverty of spirit, where
Hmm.
where materialisticness has taken away our, in my words, I'll convert it to my words,
Yeah. Yeah.
our comprehension of ourselves and our
Hmm.
inner relationship has been
Yes.
intercepted with
Hmm.
all these different things in our materialistic world. So, how do you view the world we live in? How is that impacting us? How is it affecting the way we feel about ourselves?
Hmm. Yeah. For better and for worse, one of the things that I think this book offers is that I can be a bridge for many people who are themselves living in the way that you described, that are living in this society that is Mother Teresa. She was referring to the United States, but I think that this is true for many cultures worldwide now, as corporate capitalism and a particular way of seeing the world and experiencing the world have been globalized. She said that the poverty of spirit that she experienced in the United States was greater than any she had experienced anywhere in the world. And that is a central idea of this book, is that there is so much joy, presence, belonging, purpose, love that are inherent to us and to the world. And yet they get pressed out, boxed in, we get disconnected from them, I think was the word you were using.
Yeah.
But our inherent condition is much more of those. And there's a Rumi quote that I love and I used in the book for one of the chapters that says something like, don't seek for love, seek out the barriers between you and love that have been erected within you. And that for me is just a fundamentally powerful and transformative truth, that it's not about going out into the world and seeking a particular situation or book or guru that we have to um, tap into and connect with in order to become this fuller person. It's inherent to our being, and it's more about that inner journey of opening to it and seeing where we've maybe disconnected ourselves from these inherent conditions of joy and love and spirit.
Oh, I so agree. Actually, that just about sums up the work that I do, because
Hmm.
I'm looking at the barriers that people have to really having an honest relationship with themselves, which, I've got myself as well. And
Of course.
I always say, when you resolve something or you explore something, you start instead of these barriers being like brick walls, they
Hmm.
become like honeycomb, that you're pushing holes through them and you're weakening every time you resolve something, or really understanding something, you're
Hmm.
weakening those barriers to
Hmm.
fully embracing yourself and
Right.
fully embracing the eternalness of your soul.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that so often each of those honeycombs is itself transformative. So it's not even just the liberation of that part of ourselves and that joy and freedom, right? But it actually allows us to step up to another level through the insights, some of the challenges, right? I mean, I
Yeah,
know you speak about
definitely.
this in your podcast and the episodes I've listened to.
Yeah. And the other big thing is that everything we resolve within ourselves also takes that energy out of the mass. So there's
Hmm.
less, say, I always use resentment as an example, but say you resolve your resentment, you're
Yes.
taking that resentment out of the mass energy, which gives
Yes.
more room for compassion or kindness.
Absolutely.
So
Yes.
yeah, so it's like celebrate that as well. We don't
Yes.
we don't really take a lot of notice to our interconnection to the world.
Right.
So
Right.
yeah,
The I think it's well, it's both a central point of this book and just a wondrous blessing that based on the science, and to be clear, this book is based on the research of thousands of different psychologists and economists, as well as cosmologists and activists, saints and poets. So I'm in there for sure, and some of my personal stories and thoughts, but it also is very much built on the foundation of the work of so many other people, and there are about 1,200 footnotes in the book, you
yes,
might have noticed, end notes.
yeah,
One of the central points in the book, and really I think an immense blessing for us, is that the path that these scientists and that I describe in the book that can help us each tap into this greater joy and purpose that is inherent to us, and love and awe, is also fundamentally the path that we need to be walking individually and collectively to address some of the greatest crises of our times, the massive amount of violence and destruction in the world. And in the book, I focus especially on global warming, because global warming and where we're going with that will easily surpass anything that we've ever experienced before as humans, at least since about 70,000 years ago. Um, it surpasses world wars and plagues and on and on. And there are many things that have to be done and that lots of people are focusing on that are about, well, how do we build this in a greener way, or how do we reduce the carbon emissions and so forth? But there is something that is just fundamentally flawed that is fueling the consumption and materialism that's driving so much of that destruction, and that is relentless, that is powerful and relentless, as a system and as individuals. We can get so locked into that and feel so dependent on a particular lifestyle, a particular pursuit. And so stepping back from that and dropping into the abundance of ourselves and the world, and this inherent miraculousness of us and the world, and beauty and love, as we start to let ourselves be filled with that, it takes up the spaces that money and possessions were trying to fill and distract us from, and help us maybe boost our egos a little bit by feeling those. And so the call, both for us, I think, as individuals and collectively, is that we need to all be walking this kind of path, and it will look different for each one of us.
yeah, definitely.
But to speak to what you were saying, it's not only, well, what a gift that if I walk this path, I get to experience my own liberation. But as you mentioned, we're also removing that from this larger system. And we're part of a cultural shift that can acknowledge that 98% of what we've just been living by, and the assumptions that we've been um, guided by through media, as well as, friends and family and generations going back now, and primarily our economic system and corporations, is profoundly flawed, backwards even, in terms of what actually nourishes our well-being. So we not only get to step more fully into that, and who wouldn't want that, but it's actually one of the fundamental steps we need to be taking to start to step back from this massive violence and destruction that we're sowing in the world as well.
Oh, for sure. And it's interesting because it makes sense when you understand human nature and the dark side of us. It makes sense to me why people are so materialistic and why our fears are actually steering us, and we don't
Hmm.
recognize them as fears, so we can't
Hmm.
address them. But
Hmm.
we walk into a room full of people and we have this great fear of being judged, right?
Hmm.
So what we do is we try to alleviate that potential. So
Hmm.
so that's where brands come in. If
Hmm.
you wear this brand, it says this about you. If you drive this car, it says
Right,
this about you. So
right,
we've externalized everything
right,
as a way of trying to identify who we are,
right.
instead of actually doing the inner work, which can be very scary for some people. And
Oh,
once you get past that first barrier, you love it.
right,
You,
right,
you
right.
can't. You're in. So
Well, I'm gonna just say, I would say probably more for me, it's ups and downs. Probably each time there's a little bit of pain or angst, or like even dread about going near this next thing that's revealing itself. But as it starts to work itself through, there's this sweetness, right? And the lightness in this
Yeah.
part of you that gets liberated. But I just wanted to be honest about that part for me, at least. I wish that it was just get through an initial barrier and it kind of,
Oh, no, no,
kind of,
no. Sorry. I haven't
I know you
explained
weren't
myself
trying to
well.
say that, but
Oh,
just to
because
be
the thing
honest
is,
with,
being confronted with yourself is a big thing.
right,
So,
right,
and even when you think you've got stuff sorted out, all of a sudden an event's going to happen,
right.
and
Yeah,
bang, you're going to think you're back in the fetal position, going, I know nothing, and you got
right.
to rebuild. But
Yeah.
every time you do that, so for you, there's a wealth of information in this book. So how did you get on the path,
Hmm.
or how did it start for you to actually really be prepared to have that level of honesty?
Yeah. I'm going to say that fundamentally, the most significant thing was that I was walking this path myself. I had been doing some of this deep work of facing some of my own fears and shames and suppression of different kinds of emotional places within myself. So I was myself personally experiencing some of that liberation. That was fundamental to being able to write this book. Where the book goes, and as you mentioned, it spans a lot of terrain. It looks at the psychology of happiness. It looks at some of what you were referring to about the psychology of money. How is it that money hooks us?
Hmm.
It looks at the way that our materialism channels itself and gets directed into so much destruction and violence in the world. And then, of course, in the final part, it says, now, how do we step back from that and just look at this from a completely different perspective and just embrace the wonder and miracle of us and this world? And I could have written all of that to some degree just based on all of the research that I was looking at and all of the wonderful people who've written about some of these different topics. But I think that what works for many people and why it resonates and why I'm delighted to say it won some of these recent awards is because it resonates on a heart level because I'm bringing my heart and I'm speaking from that place. I'm not speaking hypothetically about what it means to walk this path. Very clearly in the book, I lay out the ways in which, oh, I'm still walking this path.
Mm.
I'm by no means up here telling all of you how to do this. I'm in here with you, but for a lot of people, I've walked the path further than they have, and I can give them some guidance on what it looks and feels like. And I can do it from that same place of love and joy and presence and not ego or, for example, materialism. I mean, 100% of the profits from this book are going to several different nonprofits, not because I don't need money like everyone else to get certain things done in the world, but because the joy and love that has come through me into this book and now going out into this world, that's what was meant to be. Those are the kinds of things that I can bring to it when I myself have done some of this work of liberating myself from some of these just negative assumptions that drive us in some of those other directions.
Yeah. Well, I read your part on shame, and when you were
Hmm.
standing in the mirror and putting down, well, I call them your negative self beliefs,
Yep.
and there's not a person alive that, if they were willing, wouldn't go through a whole
Right.
pad to go, because once you start identifying those self beliefs that you have,
Yeah.
then you realize how much they're steering you,
Yes.
which is,
Yeah.
and that always shocks us. And it's a big thing to get your head around.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And to start to draw near to them and start to draw close to them and touch them a little bit and open them up. They have so much power.
Yeah.
For anyone listening who hasn't read the book, I'll just briefly describe the exercise that I do in my classes, which have been in a college setting and online. I do this activity where I've written down, and there are about 12 of them or more, of my deepest shames, like those beliefs I have about myself, of things that are just sort of wrong with me. And I'm not saying I even necessarily believe them in my head, but I'm just being honest about the power they have within me. They sit in a deep place. So these are the things that I don't want anyone to know or even think about when it comes to me. And I wrote them out just in a few words, each one on a little yellow sticky pad piece of paper, and one by one I read them out loud and stick them on myself, which is itself powerful and transformative to be able to just voice those and acknowledge them. It already that steals some of their power. You're already saying, well, I can't be so bad because I can actually name them. But I'll tell you, I've done it many times, and every time it's still by the end, I'm a little bit woozy. Um, but the point of the activity is, first of all, to normalize what you're saying, that this is basically all or most of us, is how we move through this world. And then we talk about the impact. Well, what are the different ways that people respond to their shames? And the word shame originally actually comes from something that has to do with hiding or to hide something, because these are the things that we lock away. We don't want other people to see them. And so we look at the ways that they change our behaviors, our relationships, the ways we do or don't put ourselves out there in our lives and in our work and the world in general. And then towards the end, what we get to do is look at, now, what does it look like to start to remove these? And it's a little simplistic because, sort of as you were saying, I wouldn't say that any of those I have gotten to completely remove. They all still exist in me, but I've softened them so much. I've been able to draw close to some of them. One of the ones that has been really powerful through my life is that I am so sensitive. And I can almost say that now with just delight and pride and joy, and want to be like, doesn't everyone want to be incredibly sensitive? Versus so many deep messages that I'd lived with and sort of physical repercussions. I mean, being bullied growing up, where this sensitivity is not a good thing. And I'm going to say there's a gender aspect to it as well. I think especially for men, being sensitive, being tough is the number one thing you've got to be doing. And being sensitive, no. And I learned that, again, whether I intellectually ever agreed with it, I took that on. And it was only when I got later in life that I started to recognize, how did this get into me? And I mean, because I hate so many things that have to do with masculinity and men, and this somehow got inside me and is working from the inside out. No, I have to, I have to work on this. But we look at what are the paths for drawing closer to each of these and starting to open them a little bit and soften them. And as I just mentioned, even perhaps draw them close and love them and start to celebrate them, right?
Yeah, oh, for sure. I actually did a workshop on the weekend, and I said to one of the people there, I said that there's things that I started looking at 30 years ago, and I'm still looking at them.
Hmm.
Because we're in a culture where we're going, just fix it, get rid of it, so I can move on and never think about it. But when you're dealing with your own inner self, it's
Right.
not like that because it's so layered. And shame, I always refer to as the hidden world,
Hmm.
because we don't identify it as as a shame,
Yeah.
but we respond to it like it is. So we
Yeah.
can feel unworthy, and
And specialists in all kinds of fields have equally come to this place of recognizing that shame is one of the driving forces in all of our lives. It shapes our societies to a large
mm,
degree. It controls us in many ways, and never for the good. Brene Brown, who's done a lot of work around shame, and I use the term self-love. People talk about self-acceptance or self-compassion sometimes, but whatever language you want to use,
I
I
will.
will say something that you said a moment ago I wanted to speak to,
Hmm.
which is that I encourage people to look at shame and the journey of relieving ourselves of some of the power of those shames in two different lights. And one is the one that you and I have just been talking about, which is that these things are deep and powerful, and the journey of healing them is long. And to be honest, I expect that I will die with these shames still within me with a certain degree of power. So, in a sense, the goal isn't that I'm going to ever get to transcend these completely, but that I get to learn and grow. They will soften. I will grow as a human being, perhaps understand things even better or have greater empathy for other people or insight than I ever could have without those. Another perspective, though, is that there's a story that's told about a conference, and I cannot remember, but I want to give credit to the person, but I'm not remembering her name right now. So I'm just going to say that she tells the story about being at a conference with the Dalai Lama, probably about 1994 or so, and they each got to ask a question. And hers was, "What do you think of self hatred?" And he looked at her And he looked at the translator and asked the translator something, and the translator said something, and they were discussing something for a while. And he turned back to her and he said, I don't understand. Can you say more about self-shame, about self-hatred? And so she talked about some of the patterns that she saw in her clients and in her meditation classes and so forth, the patterns of just the negative talk that goes on, the ways that we try and adapt to be what we think other people want to see, all these different ways that we adapt, hiding ourselves, even with our closest companions and friends and loves, hiding parts of ourselves. And the Dalai Lama once again turned to the translator and once again turned to her and said, in essence, that he was stumped, that he thought he understood human nature to a high degree, but he had never heard of this, didn't understand. He said, how can you think of this? How can you think of yourself this way when we all have Buddha nature? Which is, of course, what you and I were saying earlier about, but it's inherent to us, this joy, this worthiness, this purpose, this love. He was like, how can that be possible? Now, I think this story is powerful and important because it creates, for me, the possibility that actually maybe we really can just get beyond all of this. Maybe it is completely cultural that we take on so much negativity and so much baggage of putting ourselves down, again, at some point to the degree where we beat other people to the punch and we just keep ourselves locked up and beat ourselves up inside. Maybe and she says, I don't want to romanticize Buddhism or Tibetan culture or the Dalai Lama, but consider the fact that there could exist a culture where that kind of negative sort of shame, self judgment was actually just unnatural to the degree that it was unheard of, and where people moved in the world from this place of their Buddha nature or from this place of joy and wonder and connectedness, right? And I do think that lots of people in different cultures have lived that way. To me, it's an interesting thing to consider that, oh, it's not just that there's a little bit of shame or less shame, but maybe that's actually just something that doesn't exist in their culture that same way. I think it gives us a beautiful way of thinking of ourselves and understanding ourselves. That's an alternative to, well, I'm just going to always have this. It's kind of inherent to me. I think that there's wisdom in holding both of those, you know?
Oh, I agree. Because the, this is the way I look at that is the
Hmm.
reality. If I stripped away your emotional baggage and there was
Hmm.
just the purity of who you are,
Hmm.
then there is no possible way that you would have any self-loathing or shame or
Right,
guilt.
right,
That's you in your natural essence.
right.
When we put the baggage and everything we don't know how to cope with, and
Hmm.
unfortunately, what we do is we project
Hmm.
everything that we don't deal with. We try to get rid of it by giving it to someone else. So,
Hmm.
like jealousy, we'll
Hmm.
attack somebody,
Yeah.
and we'll run them down, and we use judgment, and we use all these
Hmm.
weapons against each other because we refuse to look at the truth of ourselves.
Yeah.
So I do think it's possible that we can evolve. Do I
Hmm.
think we can do it this lifetime? I'm not sure. You know what I mean? But I think
Hmm.
that and I also believe when we cross over, we are aware of our emotional
Hmm.
baggage, but we don't take it with us.
Mm.
That it sort of stays in this realm,
Mm.
but it's got our label on it, it's got our name on it. And as soon as we come
Hmm.
back in, guess what?
That's
Everything we
right.
haven't dealt with, she's yours. So,
Uh-huh.
and I refer to that as, somewhere along the line, you've got to clean up your own backyard.
Hmm.
So that everything that you've created that's out of kilter or off kilter with the truth of who you are is going to be in that emotional baggage. And as you go through life and you have these different experiences, they're presenting you with opportunities to
Right.
resolve what you're carrying, or it's an opportunity for you to start recreating and adding back to the emotional baggage. But we're the pivotal point. We're the
Yeah.
one deciding.
Right.
So if we don't understand that there is a possibility, then we're not going to go looking. We're not going to try. So you do need to have those understandings of who you naturally are. I read in your book you referred to as your inner song,
Mm.
the song of who you are.
Right.
Yeah. So to me, when I write, I call that uniqueness.
Hmm.
But yeah, so can you explain that, what you mean by the song within?
Well, I'm going to say what I think of. That is a beautiful quote from, I believe, a Danish or Norwegian poet whose name I cannot remember right now. But what they say is that to love another person is to basically sing back to them their song when they've forgotten it. I
Right.
think you know from looking at the book that there's a whole section that looks at the nature of love, and I think that this is not the fullness of it, but I think this is a beautiful quality, and that's why I start the book this way, and I almost end it with this, because for me the purpose of the book is largely to sing back to people the song of their beauty, which is different for each one of us, and yet the beauty is universal. And so that's what that reference to is the song of our lives, the song of our beings, the song of who we are. And for each of us to get to be there for each other at those times when it's a little bit hard or we've forgotten, and to just maybe quietly sing it into each other's ears or powerfully sing it into each other's ears through all of our different creations, movies and conversations and friendships and books and things like
Yeah.
that.
See, and I look at that as respecting the uniqueness of that other soul.
Hmm.
And if you consciously decide that you don't want to project what is unresolved within you, I don't want to lash out my jealousy on you.
Yes,
All
right,
right.
right.
So then I can choose to be respectful of your
Yeah,
uniqueness. And where
yes.
I see people losing that, I see a big change in how people are responding to one another, and that their inability to cope with what is in their emotional baggage is
Hmm.
oozing out.
Right. I think it's really interesting what you were saying about the emotional baggage, even when we leave this life, is there waiting for us. And you sort of offhand threw out there this question of how prepared are we for this kind of personal evolution, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things that has come up for me in talking with people, both about these two journeys I mentioned, this personal one, as well as the personal one, but as it relates to the larger journey and the violence and destruction in the world. And the question has come up, are you optimistic? Is this an optimistic book? Do you really believe that we are going to be able to go out there and make this kind of massive transformation? And what I think is so beautiful is that regardless of what we think of the bigger picture and where we think things are going or what might change or what might not, the fact that we ourselves as individuals have such a tremendous capacity for change and that it serves us so well as individuals, there's no reason not to walk that path. And on that one, I am very optimistic because I already said that I think I'm going to die with a certain degree of my emotional baggage, regardless of the amount of work that I'm doing, how much love I'm doing. And yet, I've seen in myself and I've seen in so many other people what even just one twist can do in terms of how we just understand something differently or unlock something that's been closed up, something that we've been holding on to so tightly and keeping at a distance. It can absolutely transform how we experience ourselves, the relationships that we're in, the work that we're doing. And so, in that sense, I'm deeply optimistic. And so it might be another question of, well, am I so optimistic that we're going to get to that point of not having any baggage? I'm not necessarily going there, but I am so optimistic about the potential within each one of us to experience greater liberation in this lifetime. And I think that's the starting point. Then that's where we should start. And let's move towards these more joyful, purposeful, wondrous lives that also feed into this essential transformation that has to be taking place.
I absolutely agree. So I'm
Yeah.
going to ask you the big question we ask all the guests
Hmm.
is, what does humanity need to acknowledge and understand for us to evolve?
Hmm. Well, and as you know from all the answers you've gotten in the different podcasts, I think there's a lot. There's a lot out there. But for me, what I'm sitting with right now that is just so fresh and powerful is what we've been talking about, our inherent joy and wonder and purpose and belonging and love. And those are all topics that we explore throughout the journey of the book. And it really gets back to what you were saying and what I was referring to in terms of in the absence of that, as an individual and in a culture where that is absent, where it's not just woven into the fabric of our society that aren't we all wondrous beings? And isn't this a miracle? Another day, another breath, light, color, right? All of this. When it's the opposite, when it's just woven into the culture, the fabric of the culture, that we are nothing, you aren't worth anything. Those are the messages that come at us over and over again. You're only worth as much as you're successful financially or in terms of your material possessions, all these kinds of things. It naturally sows the kind of violence and destruction that we're seeing at a society level and at an interrelational level and at the interpersonal level, as you referred to as well. I mean, the way that we cut ourselves up all the time, and then the way that we cut others, the way that we
Yeah.
relate to each other. And even if it's not cutting, something that so often happens, it was a therapist I'm working with right now who talked about it being a pinball machine. You talked about entering a room and fearing judgment. If I walk into a room and before anyone's even said anything, I'm already making assumptions about what they're thinking or feeling
Yeah.
when they see me. And then someone does say something, and maybe they actually even say something that is super complimentary, but I'm already hearing it through this lens of not enough and less than, or maybe some horrible things that other kids told me or that someone in my family, my parents told me growing up that's gotten in me. And I think that's who I am. First of all, I'm not really going to believe them. I'm not going to be able to fully receive it because because I don't believe that myself, but also it's going to absolutely shift what I hear and then how I respond. So
Mm.
you maybe just said something very complimentary, and I hear it as sort of sarcastic, or oh, you're just saying that. And so then what do I say? Well, then I respond out of something that's from my fear and shame based here. And then who knows what's going on with you because you're this complex being with your own set of sticky notes, right?
Yeah.
And yours happens to be one that, say, had to do with being, well, I talked about one of my other ones was like just not being sexy. And I didn't date or have sex really until I was in college. And I felt like everything on our society was telling me, oh, that's about as bad as it gets. You are just undesirable, not worthy, and I can laugh about it. But I mean, I've been talking about this and dealing with this for a couple of decades now. It got into me so deep that I wouldn't be able to just say those words because it felt like it's not like when we look at someone else's shame, we can see, oh, well, that's your dad talking, or well, that's the movies you saw when you were a kid talking. But when it's us, it's
Yeah.
gotten in there in a way that it feels true. So talking about it feels like not like I'm describing this thing that got into me somehow, but it's not really me. It's like a big neon sign I'm pulling out that's flashing and being like, loser, less than, like, so not being sexy. So here we are having this conversation, and I'm feeling like, oh my God, I'm so unattractive. And you got this thing going on like, I'm not sexy. And maybe there's actually even some good chemistry, but we're both over there. So it's this pinball thing where it just ricochets off of, and what we really want to do is relate to each other in the truth of who we are
Mm.
and our purpose and potential and just be in that richness. And maybe we still might have some disagreements or not get along, but great, it's based on reality. But for so many of us, we can hardly even get there because we get so caught up in the reactive pinball of like, oh God, they don't like me. I'm just going to get quiet. And then they're over there going like, oh, look at him. He's so quiet. He's over there judging us. He thinks he's better than us, And then I'm like, oh God, look at the way they're looking at me. I'm leaving. And they're like, he thinks he's better than us. He just left. It's like, so anyway, I like that analogy of the pinball machine. I think it's very effective. So again, in that case, it wasn't even that we necessarily cut each other down. It's just that, oh, what a ridiculous web we're
Yeah.
weaving that just limits our potential as me and
Yeah.
as us, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I talk a lot about the ricochet in
Hmm.
one of my books because we
Yeah,
are
that's great.
bouncing. Yeah, we're bouncing off one another, and
Right.
it's really interesting. Um, a friend once said to me, "When someone insults you, you ask them, 'What do you mean by that?'" And I was
Hmm.
like, "What?" And he goes, "Well, our first reaction is to pull it in." And I'm going to convert it to my words now.
Right.
Is that we pull it in and we suppress it with the other shame that we have. So this
Hmm.
person thinks that I'm less than, or, not good enough. I've wrote a lot about
Hmm.
not good enough.
Yeah.
And his approach was, no, what you do is you ask them, what did you mean by that? Because as soon as someone has to be accountable for their words,
Hmm.
they will either retreat from it, and you'll be
Right.
able to identify this
Right.
was a cannonball shot that they
Right.
weren't going to stand up and do, you know what I mean, own it.
Yeah. Right.
So you see the person that delivered it. And if you
Right.
see the person that delivers it has got no substance behind what they're doing, they're projecting out their crap, and they want to get rid of it, and they want you to wear it. And if you put it with your
Right.
shame, you know,
Right.
you play with it. So,
Right. Right.
and if we can't hold ourselves accountable, but if
Hmm.
we're willing to, if someone does insult us, say, what do you mean by that?
Right.
Not aggressively, not
Right.
attacking,
Right.
but with curiosity. What do you mean
Hmm.
by that? A, you can start a
Hmm.
dialogue, or B, you can see you can really observe that
Right.
person.
Right.
So, because there's no point joining that choir.
Right. I love that. I love that. And I think also about, well, lots of things that makes me think of, but the one I'll just name that comes to mind is that part of this journey of getting to know ourselves better and releasing ourselves from these painful shames that we generally carry is that in relationships with other people, maybe the person that we're talking about insulting us, maybe it's someone that we love very dearly, like maybe it's a very intimate partner. And
Well, they're the
maybe it's
ones
not
that
even
hurt the most.
for me, they are. That's
Yeah,
where it hurts the most for sure.
yeah.
And maybe it's not even an insult, but it's something that they just said that cuts into one of those places of shame, right? Or could potentially. Or so there's this journey of, as we get to know them, we can understand them better and let them be who they are and what they're in without reacting. But that other part is the more that we know ourselves and become like, anchored and not become reactive, as you said, having that ricochet effect happening, then even if we don't get to tease out in that moment, let's say, well, what did you
Yeah.
really mean by that? Or what are you really feeling? It means that I can be an anchor right now. I can be a rock in this relationship and in this conversation. Sometimes it's just going to happen that maybe, depending on what the topic is or the day we've had, neither of us is very anchored and we're both a little unmoored. And when something comes up, we're both going to just kind of float off or we're going to ricochet, right? But I think with time, what I've seen and what just feels so much better than being in that just reactive shutdown of like, oh God, I'm awful, is oh, that's not me. What's going on with that person right now? Again, it's an ability to hold that, even if you can't have that conversation right then of, well, what do you mean by that, right?
Yeah.
That would be the ideal place to go is let's open this up and see what's going on for you and for me. But but if one of us can be an anchor while the other one is maybe spinning off a little, it allows them to draw down a little bit, and then maybe they can be a little bit anchored when you're like, oh, and by the way, this came up for me, and you can open that a little and be in your feelings, right? And it's
For
just
sure.
it's so much more productive and it just feels so much better, right?
And it is identifying sometimes a reaction's done without thought. So we're in there before we realize. You know what I mean? Like, so when we're reactive, when we're ricocheting, and I always say to clients and myself is try and remember the value of options. When you feel whatever it is that, and you feel yourself react, if you can train yourself to go, now's the time to intercept and give myself options.
Hmm.
I can respond from here, I can respond from there.
Right,
Sometimes you've got to give yourself a minute to think so that you respond. And
right,
sometimes the best thing you can do is walk away, say nothing.
right,
Yeah. But you got to do it from a place where you're objectively observing your own reaction,
right,
instead of taking on that they're an authority over how you should feel about yourself.
right,
And that's what I mean by giving yourself options, is like that people external to me don't have the authority to dictate how I should feel about myself,
right,
and give yourself permission to hold that space, which is your anchor.
right.
But that takes a lot of work to get to that point.
And then you're in a place to be ready for what will honestly be many of your situations where maybe someone who insults you or hurts you in some way is not available to actually even have any kind of real conversation, right?
Yeah, for
You
sure. Most of
you
them wouldn't.
right. You
Yeah,
can
most of
ask
them
that
wouldn't.
question, and like you said, it might sort of pop the balloon, but in terms of actual engagement, maybe they can't go there, but you're in a place where even if you recognize right away, I'm not really asking that question because that person is spinning out or triggered or isn't worth my time, they're not in my life, right? You can make those assessments for yourself, right? Even if you can't have that actual interaction.
Yeah, and what I understand from the person that was explaining it to me
Hmm.
is that you're not always looking for that interaction. What you're
Hmm.
doing is calling it for yourself.
Right.
Yeah, okay, so something's been said. What do you mean by that?
Right.
Right. They
I love
mean,
that.
yeah, it's not really the majority of the time you're not gonna get an engagement that's gonna make any sense because 'cause they're gonna defend their position. As soon as they start defending their position, you're gonna see exactly what it's about. You know, like
Hmm.
say someone's I'm trying to get an example, but say someone's hurt you and you confront them. You know, what do you mean by that? They've said
Hmm.
something cutting about you. Let's hit that sore point, and then their next response is, "And you're not perfect." Hang on, you know, it'll be something strange that you'll go,
Right.
okay, where's that coming from?
Right.
What it actually does, and you know, it's also situational based, so sometimes it's not appropriate, but what it actually does is exposes the reality of the exchange.
Hmm.
Like this person's intent is to actually put you down or cause you harm, because what a lot of people do is they walk away and they hold it within themselves and it hits their shame points, and they
Hmm.
have the shame shudders, you know, when they go through all their history, and then all these stuff comes up,
Right.
and then they're not even sure we did that. Then some people, not all, will go, did they mean this? Did they mean that? Why did they say that? Like, can people tell?
Right.
So they
Right.
start questioning themselves.
Right.
So the reason why this guy said, put it on them, ask
Right.
them, not aggressively, he was always like,
Right.
you know, with curiosity, is you will see where they're at. So when you start questioning yourself, the other thing he'll do is go, actually, you know what? They had the
Hmm.
intent to hurt me.
Hmm.
That's where they're at.
Yeah. Right.
The rest you still have to deal with.
Right.
You know what I mean?
And
If it's a sore
yes.
point, it's a sore point. So,
Right. Right. There's
yeah,
only so much you can do.
yeah,
Um, in my course, again, the college course and the online course I do around reclaiming the sacred, we do a lot of work around vulnerability.
yeah.
And one of the things that sometimes comes up is related to what you were just saying, which is that I try to be clear. My goal is not that we are vulnerable, completely vulnerable with every person that we interact with.
No.
We get to use our judgment, and many people are not worthy of that or aren't available for that. But what I like to say is that I don't want my vulnerability to be limited by my own shames. In other words, if there is a potential for us to connect on a deeper level and know each other on a deeper level, then I want to be ready and available for that. And I want to be ready to step into that vulnerability and not be in lockdown or trying to put up a mask based on my shame.
Yeah,
But
brilliant.
again, very different from that doesn't mean that the average person, like at the checkout stand, who just said something that kind of was insulting to you, you now have an obligation to be completely just open and blah with them and
Yeah,
share
yeah.
everything, right?
You can only truly be vulnerable if you feel that you can trust where you're at.
Hmm.
Otherwise, you're always going to hold something back,
Right,
and you should. You know, there's a self protection there. But if you
right,
feel that, you know, because people can come together on a platform, and I always say, if we've both got one foot on truth, that we're looking for the truth, our intention is to
right,
be truthful,
right.
then you've got a safe place. Now they might reject that place. It might, you know, get a bit scary for them, or you might do
Yeah,
the withdrawal, which we've all
humans
experienced.
are very complex.
We are
Yeah.
very, very complex.
Hmm.
So, but it's that moment where you can identify that you can share your views and be exposed in a way
Right.
that you're trusting that the
Yes.
other person is meeting you at the same place.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
otherwise, if you try to be vulnerable to someone, I deal a lot with narcissistic abuse victims, and I
Yeah.
also do a lot with childhood sexual abuse victims.
Right.
So there's there's a protection mechanism that you have to have, because their vulnerability is so raw and so deep that
Right.
they need to know that they're safe.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Otherwise, they should protect themselves, but not with a cement wall.
Brene Brown, who's done a lot of research and talks a lot about shame and self-love, um, she says that shame cannot survive words. In other words, talking with other people and sharing our stories and opening up about our feelings and experiences, that absolutely is essential to that liberation, to softening those places and freeing ourselves from those shames. But what she also is very clear about is that doesn't necessarily mean you just tell anyone, that
Mm.
there's still a thoughtfulness. We can still be at all times protective of ourselves. We need to be, right? It's about seeking, though, the people and the situations, whether it's a friend or a therapist. It's seeking those opportunities where we can start to put words to it, and and very importantly, to recognize that it's not all or nothing. It doesn't mean, well, if you're not totally vulnerable here, then go home. It's each tiny step is such a powerful step forward for us in our journey and in terms of the way it interacts with the people around us and ripples through them and creates possibilities for them, right? Like you said, removes things from that field.
Yeah, it does. And I think too, one of the things that, if is that we should remember that if someone is willing or wants to be vulnerable and explain things to us,
Hmm.
take that as an honor, that they are
Right.
actually respecting you enough and feeling safe enough for you. That's a sacred space. You know what I mean?
Yes.
That is a sacred space. So
Yes.
if you recognize that's what you're experiencing, then that can release so much of the shame and the misconceptions. A lot of the time it's misconceptions that have created the shame.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
There is a beautiful quote by John Wellwood speaking exactly to what you were just saying. Psychologist John Wellwood, this is a quote from him in the book. It says, "When we reveal ourselves to our partner," and he is referring to a romantic partner, but this is
Okay.
relevant to anyone. When we reveal ourselves to our partner and find that this brings healing rather than harm, we make an important discovery that intimate relationship can provide a sanctuary from the world of facades, a sacred space where we can be ourselves as we are. This kind of unmasking, speaking our truth, sharing our inner struggles, and revealing our raw edges is sacred activity, which allows two souls to meet and touch more deeply.
Oh, I love it.
Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah, that
And
is
you were
brilliant.
talking exactly about how vulnerability creates that sacred space, right?
Yeah. And if you recognize it, then you really turn up with that willingness to listen. Because
Mhm.
what I see a lot of the times with people is they can take vulnerability as a time to jump in and try and be right. I talk a lot about when we're responding to people, give them time to tell their story, explain what they need to explain without quickly jumping in there and telling them what to do.
Mhm.
And I think fundamentally that's one of the mistakes that we do when we're having conversations, is that we're trying to impart our wisdom, we're trying to fix it, we're trying to feel important. So all these sort of ego responses
Right.
can happen within
Right.
us.
Right.
Whereas sometimes someone needs to just debrief
Right.
and hear it out loud what they're thinking internally. And
Yes.
and I do class that all as sacred space.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. In the book, I'm able to give a lot more credit to the sources of where I've learned these things and experienced them. But I want to just name right now that there is an amazing organization called Be Present, based in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States, that does really deep work in groups. They were founded by Lily Allen, one of the most extraordinary people I've ever met. And one of their practices is being in a small group and each person just speaking for a certain amount of time. I've heard the term check-in for people like at a meeting, we're going to do a quick check-in, and each person like 20 seconds, what's going on with you? This is more like at least 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes of just speaking about what's going on for you in your life right now. And the other people don't ask questions, don't give advice. That's in the rules, to just give them space. For many people, it's a powerful and utterly unique way of being, both
Hmm.
speaking and being heard on that level and knowing they're just listening, and for the listener to be able to release those things as well and just be present with this being sharing. Again, to use your words, what a gift we're giving each other when we step into that kind of vulnerability, right? But it's exactly what you're
Definitely.
saying, getting beyond just giving advice or our own ego or what am I going to say next, and being ready to just be present and really listen to where this human being is at and what they're sharing with us.
Yeah, we learn off each other. So, and just before we go to flip the book, the lovely story about dropping the knife
Hmm.
in your book that you've quoted someone else. Could you just end with that story, because I think that's brilliant.
Yes. Well, the quote, it says, once a young woman asked Hafez, the epic Persian mystic and poet, what is the sign of someone knowing God? Hafez remained silent for a few moments and looked deep into the young person's eyes, then said, dear, they have dropped the knife. They have dropped the cruel knife most so often use upon their tender self and others. Talk about
Yes.
stepping into the presence of the divine within us and around us, to
Yeah.
release that and just be with the truth and beauty, right?
Yeah. And it the hardest thing I've found personally is to drop the knife on myself. You know what
Hmm.
I mean? Like I'm
Absolutely.
still in that process of
Absolutely.
yeah, because we're yeah.
And some of the people who've done research around shame, they highlight that one of the strongest barriers they run up against. I mean, I think you and I have already named what I think is actually the most powerful, which is that we have taken these on as truths, and they are so painful and powerful that to even go near them can be excruciating at times.
Mm.
But they cite that one of the greatest challenges is that actually a lot of us have internalized this belief that we need to be hard on ourselves so that we will improve, so
Oh,
that
right.
we aren't just soft and let ourselves get away with all these other things that we've been doing, so that we can continue to evolve, which is actually, by probably many of our practical daily lived experiences, but also by the research, is the exact opposite. The potential for greater movement and change comes from being greater at ease with ourselves. The less that we're judging ourselves, the more that we can hear real feedback from other people, the more that we can actually ask for it, the less that we are just locking ourselves up, the more that we can reach and believe that we are worthy. I just wanted to name that because someone might be listening to this and hearing us talk about self love and shame, and that might be a lens that they put over that. And they're like, well, okay, yes, sure, some compassion, but I gotta stay on myself because I'm just this and this and this. And it's like, oh, slow up. I can't remember his name, but one of the famous psychologists I cite in the book says, the wonder of it is that it's only once I accept myself as I am that I can truly change. It just flips everything
Yes.
and opens it.
Yeah. And one of the things I found, I love that. One of the things I found for myself is I was using my hindsight. So had an experience, thousands of
Mhm.
experiences actually. And then I got to this point and I would look back and I would use my hindsight to perfect my judgment of myself. I should have.
Right,
Why did I do that? I should have known
right,
better.
right.
The Where I had to get to was that the reality was in that moment, that's how I reacted or responded, right?
Yeah,
Based on
right,
and by looking back, coming forward and looking back, the hindsight is the education that I got from that experience.
right,
But I'm beating myself up because I
right.
was naive back then, right? So
And what you're describing is, of course, so common, and
yeah,
people will look at something and chew on it for days on end, right?
yeah,
Maybe even judging themselves in a way that the person who maybe was involved in the situation themselves didn't ever think and has forgotten about already, and yet we're
mm,
still carrying something, right?
yeah, for
And what you're
sure.
describing is already actually even such a higher level of skill, right? Because I think that for many of us, the starting place is a place where we actually can just fall into a place of such self-loathing that those words may not resonate for some people, but I think that the lived reality of just absolutely, it's excruciating and shutting something down. One of the ways that shame often shows up is in violence. And it's either absolute avoidance of violence, just making yourself small and letting everything be, or it's being violent because it's so excruciating and you need to end the situation, right? So I just wanted to name that, to acknowledge and give heart to someone who hears your process and is like, wow, maybe someday. It's like, yeah, maybe someday, but that's possible for you. And in the meanwhile, let's just work on giving in a drop of compassion, even while we acknowledge that we're just in a place of lockdown perhaps, and that nothing else can be done for a little bit, right? And we're just here, just a little drop, and then it comes with time, right?
Yeah, one of the things I say to clients is, and I have to remind myself of this sometimes, think of your most favorite person on the planet. And in that experience, what would you advise them to do? How would
Mm,
you respond to them if they were in the
mm,
same,
mm.
thought process? And then try your best to do that for yourself. So,
I love that. And if I can just share this briefly, when you were saying that, where I went in my mind, just doing, I'm following your instructions, I thought of the person I already mentioned, Lily Allen, who is such an exquisite human being I admire so much. And it reminded me that with regards to what we were saying earlier about shame and, well, we need to be humble, we shouldn't be full of self-love, and, oh, well, people who actually love themselves are just either narcissistic or destructive. But that's not what we're talking about at all.
no.
And it's when you were guiding me that way that I recognized that, oh, this being of love, the way that translates is in so much care and attention and presence, everything I want to be near, right? And so
Mm,
actually it draws me more into this journey of, well, how do I love myself more so that that's how I can be with other people as well,
yeah.
right?
Be a friend to your soul.
Yeah, so thank
So,
you for that exercise. Imagine someone who you dearly love and seems like they're very self-loving and in a grounded place. And do you judge them or feel bad when you're around them? Or does that feel maybe even wonderful,
hmm,
right?
yeah, definitely. So, would you like to play Flip the Book?
Let's play Flip the Book.
Okay, you've got 3 books to pick from. Do you want book 1, 2, or
Three,
3?
three.
3. Okay,
Yes.
so this is what I refer to as the big book, which is the
Mm-hmm.
Insight and Awareness book, which
Mm-hmm.
is the book that I explained was the living document.
Yep.
Okay, so it'll be very
Right.
interesting to see where we go.
Okay.
You got
Yes.
1 to 430 pages to pick from.
184.
184. So out of curiosity, did you hear that or feel it?
It just came to me the same way that book three did. So
Okay,
I'm gonna say it was even, I can't even know whether it was a feeling or
I
up
thought
here or down here, but it just was, that's what came.
you heard it. Love it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so you've got 4 paragraphs to pick from.
Ooh, I don't know. It just came to me four. So,
4. Okay,
yeah.
so just for your understanding, this comes under
Yeah.
the heading of understanding the energetics of the mass energy of mankind. So that's the chapter heading.
Okay.
Just a little heading.
I love it.
Your soul's consciousness seeks to unify the fragmentation of your unresolved emotions by resolving your denial. The resolution of your denial enables you to experience the evolution of your soul and to free yourself from enduring your own perpetual cycles of soul oppression. Evolution is freedom, which will enable you to feel the core of your soul resonating with truth.
Mm,
Your denial and control isolates you from your truth, separating and disassociating you from the reality of being a significant, unique, independent individual soul of true source divine origin consciousness. That's the label I give where we're from. You can use
yeah.
Great Spirit, Universe,
Yeah.
whatever you like.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
um, what does that make you think and feel?
I love it. And I may be completely off base in terms of what you were thinking or the inspiration for that, where that came from. But for me, it just spoke directly to what we were talking about, that Rumi quote, seek not for love, seek for the barriers within you that have been erected against love. To me, you're naming also what I said was the one thing, if I could do it, that everyone I would wish for humanity. which is that it's not so much a game of becoming someone or something different. It's living into the fullness of who you really are. And so you talked about, for example, denial and control, as I hear those as barriers between us and the truth of our fullness and our wondrousness, right?
Yeah.
So for me, I hear a powerful thread running through our conversation and then that paragraph. Does that speak to you, or does it kind of go in a different place for you, that
No,
quote?
it's well, it a lot of the time I notice, especially with the Insight and Awareness book, it sums up what we've been talking
Mm-hmm.
about.
Mm-hmm.
So, which is always brilliant, but it is, and
Mm-hmm.
I write about denial and control. They are
Mm-hmm.
barriers. So when I look at the human energetics of the emotional baggage, so our soul's unconsciousness,
Yeah.
I break them down into barriers. So the first, we've got our core fears and beliefs and indoctrinations that are really ingrained. I call them soul denial energy.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next barrier is resistance, denial, avoidance, and codependency. And then it goes into images, illusions, and controlled identities, like the roles we give each other. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm a mother, but I'm really Lorraine mothering, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
but if I just perceive myself as just one role, that's a controlled
Mm-hmm.
identity.
Right.
And then there's judgment, manipulation, confusion, and control again. That
Mm-hmm.
is another barrier. And then there's what I refer to as controlled evolution, which
Mm-hmm.
there's lots of different labels for that kind of energy, but anything that oppresses our ability to evolve. So that
Mm-hmm.
could be a belief system, it could be indoctrinations. There's lots of reasons that
Mm-hmm.
we stop our own evolution. And then there's what I refer to as the heresy barrier, which is indifference to truth, where we become so indifferent to truth that we don't value it,
Mm-hmm.
which we can see society is, you know,
Mm-hmm.
gallops along that path
Right.
sometimes.
Right.
Resentment of reality, where we have a arrogant perception of what should be happening for us, and reality is different. So it
Right.
creates this
Right.
resentment within us,
Right.
and yeah, there's denial of reality.
Can
Yeah,
I ask you, did you say you think of those as levels, or do they just exist as each different barriers that exist?
they're barriers that exist. So your
Okay.
ricochet from what I've explored and what I've written
Yeah.
about, you're
Mm.
ricocheting throughout those barriers. It's not as simple as that.
Right.
It's a little bit more complex because
Sure.
there's different patterns that I call soul oppressive patterns as well, and there's all
Mm-hmm.
these different energetic reactions, and also we have
Right.
external, and
Right.
what our internal soul system, our soul's unconsciousness, the same system is the same as what's in the mass, but we also have collective energy. So if I've
Mm-hmm.
got resentment, then there's a collective energy of resentment. And I
Mm-hmm.
explain them to people as, think of them as like banks and bank accounts. I've got
Mm-hmm.
resentment and I've invested money in that bank account.
Mm-hmm.
And then so it's stored in two places.
Right. Yeah. Right.
So
Right.
I kick off my resentment, and all of
Right.
a sudden I can feel a mother load coming at me because it wants
Right.
to fuel it up. It wants me to
Right. We have
reinvest.
an attachment to it.
Yes.
It
Yes.
has the attachment to us, and we have the attachment to it.
It's an
Right.
exchange. Yeah. And it's in a mutual relationship. So then as I resolve mine, I
Yeah.
actually start taking that out of the mass, and all of a sudden we got to change. So
Yes.
yeah,
Right.
so that's how I've
Beautiful.
spent
Thank
30
you.
years mapping
Mm-hmm.
our soul's unconsciousness
Mm-hmm.
and their barriers to us evolving. So yeah,
I have, if there's time for just one more quote, that topic of control.
yeah,
I have a quote from Alan Watts that I think is just beautiful, that might be a nice way to start to wrap things up.
yeah, go for it.
He wrote in his book, The Wisdom of Insecurity. So for me, again, this is, you were talking about control. It came up a number of times in those barriers. There is a contradiction in wanting to be perfectly secure in a universe whose very nature is momentariness and fluidity. But the contradiction lies a little deeper than the mere conflict between the desire for security and the fact of change. Because if I want to be secure, that is, protected from the flux of life, I am wanting to be separate from life. Yet it is this very sense of separateness which makes me feel insecure. To be secure means to isolate and fortify the I, but it is just the feeling of being an isolated I which makes me feel lonely and afraid. In other words, the more security I can get, the more I shall want. To put it still more plainly, the desire for security and the feeling of insecurity are the same thing. To hold your breath is to lose your breath. A society based on the quest for security is nothing but a breath retention contest in which everyone is taut as a drum and as purple as a beet.
Yeah. See, I
I love
see.
that.
Yeah, I do too. And I see the sense of security that we try to create is often an illusion,
Hmm.
and we can't hold it.
Right.
And when it busts, a good friend of mine once said, she's no longer with us. Gail once said to me, there's two kinds of people in the world. There's those that the bubble has busted, and there's those that hasn't busted enough yet. And I get what she meant was that when we hold on to an illusion and we think that's going to give us security, somewhere along that's going to blow,
Right. Right.
and then can we deal with that?
Right.
So
Right.
I've really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you,
Thank
Jeff.
you. Me
And
too. Thank you for giving me this time to explore some of these questions a little more in depth.